Hello, my beautiful CE students. This lesson is one of the most important things you'll learn in any English class ever. It'll also be ideas that you take with you throughout your entire college career, throughout your professional life, and also just as an informed citizen, examining the credibility of the sources of information that come into your life. So in terms of whether or not you can use a certain source for appropriate academic use, this is for our purposes for this course, it's very, very important that you are extremely skeptical of any source that comes across your computer screen. So this right here should be your general vibe until a source you find is proven credible. So use the rules that they tell you when you're going to buy a house. Don't fall in love with the house. Don't get attached until you figure out whether or not it's right for you. So in the case of credible sources, don't fall in love with a source until you figure out whether or not it's credible and usable. A lot of times students will come to me and say, this source, it's out of date, but it has such good information. Can I please still use it? And the answer is no, because again, the purpose of using academic sources in your academic writing is to give it legitimacy. And if you're using sources that are not credible, it undermines the legitimacy of your writing and of the ethical value of whatever academic writing you're producing. So when we talk about credibility, what we mean is when you're using a source for any research paper or any type of writing in academia, the source has to be trustworthy and the information in that source has to be reliable and accurate, and it needs to be the type of source that's appropriate for formal academic use. So there's several different ways to look at credibility, and that's what this lesson is about today. But it's important to look at a source for all the different points of credibility before you determine whether it's credible. So a source can be credible in some areas and not credible in other areas. And when we are doing formal academic writing, it's important that the sources are credible in all areas, which is a lot easier said than done. So why does the credibility matter? Again, your ability to find credible sources will be important for your college life, for your professional life, and even in your personal life. Every source that you use for academic purposes has to be carefully vetted for credibility. And in CE English, you'll have to prove to your instructor that the sources you've chosen are indeed credible. So the first point of credibility, and there are many, the first point of credibility is probably the most obvious one, but that's author credibility. It's the author's trustworthiness. And the thing that makes an author trustworthy is their educational background. Do they have degrees in this topic of study? Are they currently employed as a professional in that area of study? So an author's professional employment background and details and their educational background should always be discussed. Also, a credible writer should be an actual expert on the topic that they're writing about. But if the writer doesn't, say, have a degree in that subject, they can also be a credible writer if they prove in their source that they have formally researched the topic in a credible academic way. And so a way to tell whether or not the author has researched the topic is just like you're asked to do in your English classes. Authors will have a list of sources that they used to write that source. So if you can go look and see that that author has used credible sources to write the source that you're using, then you can, even if they're not an expert in the field, then you can confirm that they have formally researched the topic in a credible way. A credible author is also going to go into appropriate depth and detail for the writing. They're not going to make big giant jumps in reasoning or huge misleading generalizations, or they're not going to make claims that they don't back up with research and data. So again, the author credibility is an obvious major main point of credibility, but the author's credibility is separate from the credibility of the publisher or the news outlet that they publish their writing through. So you can have a credible author that publishes through a non-credible outlet or publisher, and you can have a credible outlet or publisher that publishes non-credible writing. So that's why we have to examine the credibility of the publisher and the author separately. So an author's credibility, an outlet's credibility, there's a lot of different outlets out there, so we have to talk about their credibility based on the type of source that we're looking for. So first of all, we have scholarly journal articles, and scholarly journal articles are written in academic journals. That's what you'll find on JSTOR or EBSCO, all of those big, fat, scary sources that are 20 pages long and have tons of sections and lots of graphs. That's a scholarly journal article, and something can only be called a scholarly journal article if it has these three main components. So by definition, a scholarly article is a formally researched paper that is written by an expert in that topic or a group of experts in the topic. So those are the scholarly journal articles for which you'll have like 4 or 5 authors. That's because it's a group of experts researching this topic and creating more research to enter into the conversation on this topic. And then not only do experts write the information, but scholarly journal articles are peer reviewed, which is a fancy way of saying that other experts that didn't write the source, didn't write the article, other experts read it and verified the research in there. They verified the data that's used and the research methods that are used. And so not only was the article written by an expert, but it was verified by other experts. That's what peer-reviewed means. And then because often the people who are writing a scholarly journal article are the people who are actually conducting the scientific research that goes behind the information in the article, that scholarly article is going to contain meaningful data and extensive evidence to support any claims that are made. So scholarly articles are widely considered to be the most credible sources that you can use in research, and that's why we require a certain number of scholarly articles to be used in any research paper that's ever assigned in pretty much any academic situation. So another huge resource for research is obviously the internet, but not all websites are created equal. Not all websites are credible. So you got to take a look at the website. Does it look reputable? Does it look professional? Another really important thing to understand is if the website is trying to sell you anything in any way, shape, or form, that makes the source less reliable, because when somebody is trying to sell you something, they do not have information as their goal. They have selling something as their goal, which could mean that they're using less than ethical or less than credible tactics to get you to believe what they're putting out there. So anytime advertisements are present or anytime anyone's trying to sell you something, question the source. Now, there are some sources that are credible even though they have advertisements on the site, but it's just a big indication that what you're reading might not be credible. The other thing is you can check to see if a website is credible if there's links on the page. If you check those links and the links are broken or they don't have a direct line to a different website, it can mean that no one has updated this website in a long time, which could be a good indicator that the information is outdated, which is a big no-no. So you can scroll to the bottom of the screen and look at the updated date at the bottom, and it should be 2020 or 2019 at the latest. If it hasn't been updated in the past 2 years, it's not your friend. Don't use it. And then a website URL and the suffix that comes at the very end of a URL can be a huge help to figure out whether or not a website is credible. So you'll see, .edu, .gov, .org, .com, .net, right? Those all mean separate things, and they all mean that it's a certain type of website. So those will help indicate whether or not the information in that source is credible. So if you see edu or .gov, that means it's an informational resource that is usually peer-reviewed and it's like a federal or a state resource or a governmental agency. So it's usually considered to be credible, but again, still you have to watch for non-credible claims. But edu or .gov are usually considered to be the most reliable types of websites for research. We also have .org, which is kind of a mixed bag. .org just means that it's an organization. And a lot of organizations are bipartisan, which means that they're not biased in terms of politics. And a lot of them are reputable, but many organizations are trying to sell ideas or influence public opinion in one way or another. They usually take money from special interest groups. So it's important to understand that some organizations are trying to get something from their readers, so they might not be reputable. But overall, .org websites are considered pretty credible, but you still do need to use some scrutiny. So .com simply is short for commerce, which means selling something, right? So .com can mean business or marketing resources. Those are sponsored by a commercial entity, again, that's trying to sell you something. So sometimes these pages can be pretty reputable and unbiased, but others can be pretty not credible. So make sure you use scrutiny for that. And again, most news resources are going to come from a .com URL as well. And they can provide extremely current and reliable information on current topics, and that's great. But not all news sources are unbiased. And so it's very important that you vet the commercial entity for its credibility, and that's part of an outlet credibility as well. And then .net websites just apply to sites that don't fit into any of these other categories. And so just by nature of them not fitting into one of these categories, you should scrutinize them. Be careful with those. So again, we have news outlets. You know, we're talking like the New York Times, U.S. News and World Report, Time Magazine, the Washington Post. That's what we're talking. We're talking about newspapers, magazines, news conglomerates, news outlets, right? So unfortunately, in America especially, news outlets are very biased for the most part. A lot of news outlets are run by publishing companies that receive funding from special interest groups or have special interests in mind, which means that they can tend to lead to one political side or another. And leaning to one political side or another slightly isn't too crazy. But if you're leaning really far to one side or another, the information that your outlet can produce can be very, very biased and non-credible. So it's important to know what publication your author is writing through and whether or not that publication has a history of being credible. So we have an infographic that will help you know what news organizations are credible and not credible based on their history. But this infographic is kind of hard for some students because they personally disagree with this infographic, or they like some of the news sources that are shown to be relatively biased. So sometimes it's a little difficult for students, but remember, it's okay if you personally disagree with this infographic. Just remember that this infographic represents what's widely accepted to be the credibility level of each outlet. So even if you disagree with it, we're not writing about your own opinion. We're writing about general research-based, widely accepted opinions about that outlet. So the infographic that I'm going to show you, it was created using a careful and unbiased research process by people who are very careful not to let their own personal biases dictate how they categorized each news outlet. And that being said, again, people will disagree with several things on this resource, and that's okay. But it's important to understand what's generally accepted to be reputable, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to get information from reputable sources. So you'll see that some sources skew very slightly to one political side or the other, but they're still considered credible because they report facts and they represent a range of stories within a source that it's usually what they're reporting is true and factual. Anything outside of this box, you should question. It's okay to use sources that are from this general area right here, this middle area, but in your annotated bibliography and in your writing, it would be important to disclose that this source, maybe your author is very credible, but the media outlet that's publishing that source has a reputation for skewing on one political side or the other, and you just need to disclose that when you are using a source that has bias in it. Again, a source can have bias and still be credible, and we'll talk about that. I will give you a copy of this infographic so you'll have it with you to refer to. So another really important point of credibility for sources is the date that they were published. And I know it sounds nitpicky, but keep in mind, information can become extremely outdated extremely quickly, especially in today's world. So for instance, if I were writing a research paper about social media, since social media changes and the news about social media changes weekly, it wouldn't make any sense for me to use an article that's 2 years old, because social media is not the same today as it was 2 years ago. It's not the same today as it was 6 months ago. So it's important to understand that you have to use up-to-date information, and the type of source kind of dictates how up-to-date information is. All of these date range guidelines you need to take with a grain of salt, because you might need to be even more scrutinizing in your date credibility, especially if you choose a topic that is subject to rapid change, like technology, right? So for instance, a scholarly journal article, because of the nature of that type of article, the research has been peer reviewed, it's a long time in development. So the information from a scholarly journal article is considered accurate for much longer than other types of articles. So when you're looking for a scholarly journal article, it needs to be published within the past 8 years, which means it needs to be published between 2012 and 2020. But if you're using a regular news article, one that is not peer reviewed, one that's not an academic scholarly article, the credibility date range changes drastically, because news articles are written to address immediate issues, immediate, topical, popular issues, and some online news articles can go out of date in 24 hours. So it's really important to understand that if you're using a non-scholarly article, it's only credible within 2 years, and that is even taken with a grain of salt. If you have a topic that is constantly changing, you might need to make sure it's more recent than 2 years old. So make sure that if you're using a non-scholarly article, it's published between 2018 and 2020. So if you're using like a book like old people used to hold, like things in their hand with pages, and they would turn the pages and like read off of pages. I know it's crazy. Not even like a screen page, like a page that was made out of paper. I know it's crazy, but in yesteryear it used to happen. So because of the nature of a print book, because it's peer reviewed and it has to go through a credibility check process to be published as a book, it lasts quite a bit of time. The information in a print book or an ebook print lasts quite a bit of time. So you can use a print book that's within 10 years of publication. So if you want to use a book or an ebook, which is literally just a print book that's page for page put on in electronic form, you need to find one that's published between 2010 and 2020. And if you use a video, it's okay. Some videos are really awesome resources, but most videos, just because any weirdo can post something on the internet, you got to be really careful with video content. You have to scrutinize it for accuracy, credibility, author credibility, and it needs to be recent information. So again, the whole point here with date credibility is to make sure that the information you're presenting is accurate and up to date. It's a super important part of credibility. So a lot of students will find an article that they just love and it says everything that they're looking for, but if the date falls outside the guidelines, the information is not usable. I know it's sad, it's a sad day, but it's not usable. So bias credibility, and this is, I know it's confusing for students because we teach students to write without their bias. We try to have them remove their bias from their writing, but an author for a scholarly journal article is going to write without bias at all, right? Because they are backing up everything they say with the research that they're presenting. But news sources, like editorial news sources, can have opinions in there. You can use those as academic sources, but there's a difference between any random person's opinion and an educated, research-based opinion. And so you can use an editorial source as long as the opinion within the source is educated, meaning the author has credibility in that area, and that the opinions discussed in that source are supported by credible research and credible data, other credible sources. Again, and that kind of goes along with the accuracy of the information. all of the information in any source that you give should be accurate. It should be backed up by research. It should be up to date. It should be credible. So your author should use other credible authors to support their opinions, and they shouldn't jump to any unsubstantiated conclusions. They shouldn't have flawed logic or big holes in their ideas to explain their thinking. You should be able to follow their thinking, and each step of their line of reasoning should be supported by credible research. Another really important thing to consider when you're checking the credibility is the author's purpose, right? When we're looking for informational resources, we're looking for sources that their first purpose is to inform their audience. If you look at sources where their first purpose is not to inform, but to persuade their audience to agree with them or to change their mind, then you have issues of credibility, because when somebody is not trying to inform, they're trying to persuade, they could possibly use methods of persuasion that might not be ethical or credible, or they might not be backing up their information with research. So the purpose of all of the writing that you find should be to inform. You can have a little persuasion in there as well, but the methods of persuasion that the author uses need to be ethical, and we'll talk about that in a second. So we have names for the methods of persuasion that people use. So any writer is always going to be using at least one method of persuasion, if not a combination of those methods. And we have 3 established methods of persuasion just in writing in the world as a whole. And they're called ethos, pathos, and logos. And they're all Greek roots for how you get people to believe you, how you get people to come to your side or agree with you. So we have the word ethos, which is part of the Greek root for the word ethics, right? And so what we mean by ethos is when we're trying to persuade someone, we persuade them using the credibility of the person doing the persuading, the author, right? So is that author trustworthy? Is that author educated in that field? And we also use ethos to describe the morals that come along with being a leader in a field of study. So people with PhDs, somebody who's an actual doctor has the ethos necessary to give medical advice, right? And so also we have the persuasion method called logos, which is the Greek root for the word logic, right? So a lot of methods of persuasion are based in evidence and data and truth and research. And that's what we call using logic to persuade someone. So that's what we call a responsible means of persuasion. So most of your academic sources should primarily be using ethos, which is the trustworthiness and the intelligence and the education level of the author, using evidence, data, and research to support their assertions, right? So that's any trustworthy, credible article is going to rely heavily on ethos and logos to communicate information and to persuade. Now, here's where we get into some sticky situations. If an author is trying to use pathos, which is the Greek root for words for emotion, so we're using like pathology, right? If an author is using pathos, it means that they're using emotions and prejudices and their own personal motivations, feelings, opinions, right, to persuade. And pathos can get a little dangerous because when you use your own emotions to persuade, sometimes you abandon logic and credibility. So pathos can get a little dangerous. However, there are some authors that can credibly use pathos, like for instance, they'll use an example from their own life, right? That's part of their emotions, an example from their own life to kind of hook the reader into the information, but then they'll back up that emotional appeal with the credibility piece and the logic piece. So it's okay if your sources use a little bit of pathos, but the primary methods of persuasion should always be that ethos and that logos, or the trustworthiness of the author, the education of the author, the expertise of the author, using evidence, data, research, and truth to back up their opinion. So when we discuss the credibility of a source, we always talk about what combination of rhetorical persuasion tactics are they using? And hopefully it should be mostly logos and ethos. Again, so in any academic situation, you're going to be required to prove the credibility of the sources that you use. It's just part of being in the academic world. You'll always, always, always have to vet your sources for credibility, and you'll always have to only use credible sources in any type of research for any academic class. So keep in mind that there is so much information out there, and information that might look good at first glance. But compared to the wealth of information that is out there on the internet, in books, in scholarly journals, the relative amount of information that you can actually use credibly is actually very tiny. So please be extremely discerning and skeptical of any source that comes across your computer screen, because at the end of the day, we're looking to be ethical, academic writers that use credible information to convey ideas and research in a responsible way. And so with credibility, you're on your way to becoming a titan of English composition. I mean, I can't wait to see what you come up with your sources. Okay, bye.